The cellar of a crumbling house in a fallen kingdom under a chaos dome. Moondark. 1st of Shiga. 13 years after the fall of Wyndham. At Murdoch's beckoning, silence falls among the three, giving each of them a chance not only to listen outward, but also inward, and reflect on the monumental task ahead and how truly alone and disconnected they are at this moment. Nellike, whose interior world is much more expressive than her taciturn exterior, finds comfort in the presence of the spirits with her. Quinn instead busies himself on second thought pocketing that little bag of teeth because to his mind you never know what use you might find for it, and overall just tries not to disturb the silence and not perhaps listen too closely to his own thoughts. While Murdoch, well, he just strains, focused entirely on the outside, and listens and hears, off in the distance, muffled by the rotting wood of the trapdoor, the soft chime of a church bell. Well, says Murdoch, where there is ringing, there's a ringer. Hello friends, Anderson here. Welcome back to EVENNIGHT, the second week, or rather the first full week of the Dungeon 23 challenge, where we'll be building 7 rooms in this one episode that might end up being split in 2. I'm not fully confident how long I want these episodes to be. I'm trying to keep them under 25 minutes, so if I end up going over, I will do another Thursday installment and just fade in and out. Or rather, out and in. As usual, subscribing helps you follow along with the series, and liking and commenting help the series to be found by others who'd like to follow along, so thanks for that. The noise was generated by the Dungeon Dozen table, a D12 collection of tables, and it is a very useful resource to fill in all kinds of details. Comes highly recommended. Now, we've heard distant church bell ringing, which means there's also a chapel or a church of some sort, and as Murdoch has rightly pointed out, where there is a ringing, there is a ringer, but we already knew that there is going to be some restless dead around here, only the 3 of them don't really know that. However, that gives us not much of a clue what is adjacent to this, which is what I was kind of fishing for. What is logical to me though, and that is something I would like to just decide right now, is that this trapdoor, when it popped open, leads into the street, into the road, which is then turned into kind of a dungeon corridor by the presence of walls and crumbling houses and debris everywhere, because this town that I'm imagining, this sanctuary town of Orin, is not in particularly good shape. So there will be some standing structures to explore, that will be our dungeon rooms, but most of this is just piles of rubble that are rather intraversible. So that's what we're opening into. Let's define a shape for our corridor and a length for our corridor, which is going to be the road. And that means it's time for the TOAD, the Tome of Adventure Design, and for my old man reading glasses, I'm going to use the transition table here, which is a percentage die table as usual, and see what kind of a transition we have. And naturally, this will require some interpretation and perhaps some overruling, because there's some stuff in there that doesn't necessarily make sense. 19 is a long, straight corridor, which then would help us define a general layout, and as a base template that provides us with a roughly 50 meters or 160 foot road, about 25 in either direction, lined with rubble and formerly paved, sunk into the mud, and the collapsed house ruins sort of serving as walls. I've added some room designations here to make it easier to keep track of things. So this is A1 is the cellar, and A2 is the current corridor that we're operating in. Let's dress it up a bit. I would like a smell, some general dungeon dressing, and a small item that is placed right outside the trapdoor. After a brief, hushed deliberation in the downstairs cellar, Murdoch slowly props open the trapdoor, listening for any sign of a first hint of a creak, having prior already oiled the hinges he could reach so as not to make a sound. And as Quinn restores his little oil flask, given back to him by his rogue companion, to his backpack, the rogue himself pokes his head out into a nighttime scene of decay as the stench of decomposing animal flesh hits his nostrils. And with his eyes adjusting to the murk around him, he recognizes some shapes lying strewn alongside this long, straight stretch of passageway, the side of which is dotted by rotting carcasses of fighting dogs. And as he further opens the trapdoor and then the other half of it, he has to suppress a gasp and recoil momentarily as a small deluge of rodent skeletons tumbles down the steps from a pile that had been resting against it and now lodged loose is coming down and tumbling down, shattering on the earthen floor below. Now, before we come out, let us do our dungeon die roll to see whether anything awaits us here. That's a die 8. There's a discovery to be made here. 1, a special room. 2, a tomb. That requires some interpretation, but as Murdoch lifts his gaze beyond the decomposing dogs, he makes out at the northern end of the passage a couple of hastily erected makeshift gallows from which dangle several desiccated, half-decomposed corpses. And as he turns towards the southern end, there between two still somewhat taller walls with the roof beams jutting out like a grisly garland strung up on a rope across the road, dangle yet more. We do have an executioner at work here anyway, so figure if I roll a tomb, I'll just interpret this as his idea of, well, disposing of some corpses, I guess. But since we don't have a combat encounter here or a clue or anything obvious to really immediately ascertain, I would say we determine what is at the northern and southern end of this passage through the ruined town of Gale Kirk, and maybe also eventually place the Gale Kirk itself, the church, the bells of which we've already heard softly ringing. But yeah, I feel like before we step out, we should know what we really see when we look north and south. So let's start with the south and see what awaits them who pass under the grisly garland of dangling decomposition. This leads to a larger square, sort of 30 by 30, but I took some liberties with this, especially since it also called out a diamond shape, and I kind of squeezed it in at an angle and made the longest part 30, and then yeah, we'll just compress it together a little bit to make it work. There will be some exits and openings and passageways here, I think. To not make it overly complicated, I would say we have 2 directions to go in. So let's place one here and one here, where the path can continue. It's maybe a good time to break out the hack solo and ask our first oracle question, which is that church bell ringing coming from here? And the way hack solo does this is by setting a default line of 13 to roll under, similar to an attribute check in the Black Sword hack, and to always pick the yes as the thing that will be best for advancing your story, even if it's not the best for your group of characters. Now, I'm pretty neutral on whether or not the church needs to be there or not, or the chapel or whatever it is, but let's just go with a yes. So is the church down there? Yes, roll under. 13, no, roll over. All right, the ringing is coming from here, so let us also just place our to the chapel. So somebody is in there, and something's probably going on down here then. Since it is kind of a square, let's go back to random cities and town tables and give it some decor, which is a die 20 roll. to a pedestal with something else as decor mounted on it. So we roll again. 8, that's lamps, oil, burning, illumination, maybe. Considering the general ambience here, that is also potentially something else, maybe. Let me quickly go back to smells. 78, smoke. We really do have the dice on our side. So what I'm picturing as a pedestal is more like a pyre erected in the center of this. A burning pyre filling the air up with smoke. And of course we have our humanoid shapes lying all over the place here, since our executioner imposes the theme here, which in other nicer circumstances might have been a nice pedestal with some lamps, turns out to be a funeral pyre of burning corpses in this context, especially since it's right outside the chapel. Smell is thick, acrid smoke and burning flesh. Let's throw down some dungeon dressing, one general, one weird. A dead skeletal mule, still in its harness, lies in front of a broken cart off to the side of the bonfire, and next to the entrance into the chapel is a neatly stacked pyramid of spears leaning against one another, indicating that perhaps whoever left those there is nearby or inside the chapel. Dungeon die time. To be found here is the discovery of a weapon, and rolling on the black sword hack weapon table we find it's a fancy rapier, which I take it is also leaning against the entrance of the wall of the chapel, and perhaps that's the officer's weapon. Then perhaps there is a group of still sane guardians of this place, the followers of Orin maybe, attending kind of a church service here, and they are going in unarmed. So we can already determine this for the chapel. A group of Orin's guards attend a service. That's what we're coming across if we pursue down here. I'll make that A3. Now, decision time. Up north, is this another square? Maybe not as plausible as just a bend in the road. So let's go with a yes if it's a bend in the road, and ask the oracle, is it a bend in the road or another square, for the sake of rolling up a room? Okay, it's a bend in the road. For ease of mapping, I will decide it bends eastward, and it's not a T-junction. Short or long? Is it a long one? Yes. So we'll continue in this vein with the ruin line, and then we see what is at the end of this and what's in this. And that leaves us with a scene where the sounds are echoing from the next room, and they are 10, the sounds of fighting, whereas the road itself is covered in fresh and not so fresh bloodstains and lined with more small handfuls of teeth. Now this already gives me an idea what's at the end here, because this goes to, let's call it the fighting pit. And I think we'll also decide that this is where our pitmaster can be encountered right now. Doesn't strike me as the church-going type, so perhaps while the comrades are taking in their religious service to whatever deity they worship in this, he is training his dogs, and that is the sound of the fighting that we're hearing. Let's add a few more numbers. Let's do A4 for the chapel, A5 for this, and A6 for the fighting pit. And I think now that we know that our guy is up there holding a training session, we're curious to find whether it's only his cellar that's left or whether his hovel is left standing. So let's ask, is the dog fighting pitmaster's house still standing? Yes. And I think I want to make that slightly bigger than the cellar, so we'll extend it almost by, well, double. And we will detail it down here. I'll call it A1/2 because it kind of belongs together. Now, before we lose ourselves completely here, we have to determine the dungeon die for the corridor still. which is a 1 and gives us nothing. So there's nothing more to be discovered there besides the foreshadowing of the fighting pit. And for the purpose of today's building, I think we'll add one more corridor and we'll make it like a sort of a special kind of slightly winding one here that maybe also leads to the back of this former block of collapsed houses, but then also kind of joins up in the direction of our fighting pit, so we can also link that a little bit. So here is still a question mark. This is A7, which means we'll have to dress up and detail now the pitmaster's house, the fighting pit, the chapel, and one more winding corridor road. And I think besides the usual furniture and amenities, we can also kind of bisect maybe the pitmaster's house, make it into 2 rooms. He's got a little cot here, and for the rest we will ask 3 times the items in a bandit hideout, because that already worked so well for the cellar. And that gives us an unsent letter lying on a small writing desk in a corner that we kind of add for the sake of logic, a longsword that is mounted to a wall rack, and some deer pelts that are down on the wooden floor to give a little bit of comfort and warmth and just serve in lieu of a carpet. Let's add a little fireplace and like a random table with a chair and maybe some random closets and cupboards and stuff, just so it's a little bit more plausible. Maybe like a little wall shelf as well. And then we have our pitmasters dungeon die, of course. 8 gives us a hostile encounter, which would, without rolling, just tell me he has left some guard dogs behind. One of them, so maybe his favorite, one that he allows to share the house and that doesn't need to join in the training because he's no longer fighting. It's kind of his favorite. So I'll add an exclamation point here and mark this as encounter. One massive guard dog. And I think we'll determine the contents of our unsent letter using the improvisation prompts from the hack solo. So there's a 2d12 roll, and each of the column reflects kind of a different quality of the answer. So we can pick like a sort of an activity kind of word and a focus kind of word. I think I'll pair up these 2 for now. And what I'm getting here is the prompt small and visible. And what I'd like to do with those is make that letter describe pretty much the shattering of Wyndham, make it be a bit older. And the contents of the letter are the musings of this pitmaster, who is perhaps a bit more educated than his station would suggest. And they describe how from the now ruined edge of town on the precipice of chaos, you can sometimes see small and visible in the distance another part of Wyndham, of the kingdom, another area, and it seems to come closer and disappear every now and then on a certain rhythm. I think that sets a bit of a groundwork for an option to have those areas occasionally converge. I think we should get ourselves a chapel next, and I would like to make that chapel somewhat important. I feel that is warranted. So we already have a bunch of information about it, and I don't want to give it too much more just to begin with. So I'll just put in place call it like a general chapel template plopped down here, and then we'll fill it with some of the randomly generated stuff. But what I'd like to do, which is why I say I'd like it to matter, is I'd like it to, especially given that we have the potential encounter there with whoever left the spears outside, I'd like to give it some added rooms that we can explore as additional rooms that we can build once our party makes it through here. So for me, in the playthrough part of this might also be a potential peak point of the actual playthrough, and perhaps even a point where we meet an NPC, because somebody surely has to be conducting this rite. Maybe it's the captain, but maybe it's a captive or one of the neutrals. There have to be some sane ones left here if we orient ourselves by demon souls logic, even if sane is a genuinely relative term here. So I'm curious to explore this chapel in more detail, and I would like to give it the option to have more details. So what I'm gonna do is, we'll take this as our rough outline, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna roll a die 4 and I'll add that many additional exits and doors to this. Perhaps even trapdoors. Perhaps there's a crypta. Ooh. 3. We get 3 additional doors. So let's say we have our ceremonial platform over here. Give it a slight elevation. Naturally there'll be an altar. But then I think back here we'll get a descent into the crypta, because I want one in a place with the restless dead. It might be collapsed, it might be empty, but I want it to be there. And then some additional side rooms that we can place here to make it a bit more church-like. So we have this general layout. If that strikes you as slightly phallic, like I said, church-like. So moving right along, our mission is to design A4 today, not A4 2, A4 3, or A4 4. We'll do those next time, I think, because I think we're gonna come down here. And we already know that this is a chapel where there is a service in place right now, so we'll place a few pews and maybe like a little shrine here, and we'll leave some empty space for us to put some more dressing in here. And we know we have an encounter here. I think that is pretty much decided already. I'll mark it as die 12 guards. So it could be undead. Like, I'm thinking maybe there is also something going on where there's a restless dead just going through the motion of their previous lives, and there is like a shuffling horde of zombies currently praying at the altar, and maybe nobody is conducting the mass. That is something we should probably find out. So we'll ask again. I would like it to be a yes, so I make that the more likely answer in line with our hack solo rules. Is somebody conducting this mass that doesn't belong to this group of encounter people that we will still need to flesh out? 1. Extreme, yes! An NPC. An important one. Somebody is here and they are relevant. They have information maybe about Orin or something of the sort. So, potential ally. Potential information source. I sadly don't really have any specific dressing that I can immediately find for a temple or a chapel or a church of some sort, so I'm just gonna do 1 general dungeon dressing, 1 weird dungeon dressing, and 1 small item. Perhaps between that we get a story told, so that's 3 die 100 rolls. And what that gives us is a small chalice on the altar in front of whoever it is that is conducting this service for whoever it is that is attending this service. And in that chalice, burning is a handful of laurel leaves and crushed with other ritual plants that are held in esteem by this religion. And right next to it, a string with a number of prayer beads lined up and halfway through in progress, as during the service the beads get moved along as part of the ritus. But most eye-catchingly of all is this thus far empty part where perhaps there used to be something, but now here unreality creeps in, as this is where the Chaos Dome has bitten off a chunk of what used to be Galekirk's landmass, and through a framed hole in the wall that has been reinforced laboriously by somebody, opens up a window into chaos, into the swirling nothingness that is also serving as the sky above in this fallen kingdom under the dome. So I think this is where we should probably again go with the oracle question. So first question that I have, the encounter with those guards that have so nicely stacked up their spears outside and their saber or their rapier and are now attending mass. Is this just a bunch of reanimated zombies going through the motions? Or is this sentient minions, undead or alive? Doesn't matter. But I think it'd be cool if it was just kind of not immediately a hostile encounter, but more potentially a sad scene where these shuffling former town guard, castle guard, or whatever they were, still follow their old life routine, presumably also fueled by some sort of necromantic power that is Orin's hold over this place, who will likely just constantly reanimate and then execute again and reanimate and execute again. That's sort of my mental image I'm getting right now. So I'm leaning with this one towards the yes. So is this a bunch of zombies going through the motions and attending mass? And the dice are with me again. I get my wish. We have die 12 zombies plus one of their lieutenants. 7. So we have like a captain, a zombie, a zombie, a zombie, and the captain's like a zombie with a nicer uniform. We'll leave the who is it for now. I think who is conducting this service is got to be quite an interesting person, maybe a very compassionate person, maybe a very scared person, depending on what the motivation is for them to go through with this. But we do roll our dungeon die, of course. So if we roll a hostile encounter here, we can also immediately assume that the zombies are going to round on us as soon as we enter. But we end up with a discovery that is treasure and contains gems. So I'm also putting like a religious icon here, and we'll make it gem encrusted. If we're feeling particularly ruthless and murder hobo-ish, we can of course do something about that, but this is just more dressing, I feel. Cool. I'm happy with that. And that, my friends, seems about as good a point in time as any to make a quick cut in this episode and pick it up again on Thursday. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you then, and bye for now.